I arrived at my parents' house in Tacoma just after noon, a little later than planned, carrying a small duffel bag and my sketchbook wrapped in an old scarf. The air smelled like pine and something faintly sweet. Probably Mom's honey ham, which she always made for family gatherings, even when no one specifically asked for it. The house hadn't changed. Same weathered porch swing, same cracked step near the railing that Dad always said he'd fix next weekend. It was strange how a place could stay so still, while the people inside moved forward, sometimes without you. Inside, the house buzzed with voices. Chloe's laugh echoed from the kitchen. I followed the sound and found her surrounded by a cluster of aunts and cousins, glowing in a cream-colored blouse and wine-colored lipstick that made her look even more like the magazine cover version of herself. Beside her stood Ryan, her fiancé, tall, clean-cut, with a handshake like a campaign photo op. They looked like the kind of couple people point to and say, "Now that's a future." "Lena." Chloe beamed, pulling me into a quick hug before turning back to the circle. "Everyone, this is my sister, the artist I was telling you about, the one who draws those adorable animal books." There was a round of polite smiles. One aunt said, "Oh, right, the bunny book. My niece loves that one." I nodded, clutching my sketchbook closer. "Thanks. That one was fun." I didn't stay in the kitchen long. I slipped into the hallway and made my way to the living room, where Dad was sitting on the edge of the couch, a plastic cup of soda in one hand, nodding along as someone from Ryan's family talked about Chloe's residency program. "She's so driven," the woman said. "Such a strong foundation. It's clear she comes from a home that values discipline." Dad nodded again. No smile, just a satisfied tilt of his head. The kind of nod he used to give students who turned in assignments early. It wasn't much, but it meant something. When I sat down across the room, he looked over and gave a small wave. No words, just a quick gesture before turning back to the conversation. I should have been used to it by now. At 29, you'd think I'd have stopped hoping for more. But some habits are harder to break than others. A few minutes later, during a lull in the noise, someone I didn't recognize, maybe Ryan's cousin, asked me, "So, Lena, are you still trying to find something full-time? Or just doing your art for now?" I blinked, a little thrown. "I illustrate children's books," I said evenly. "Freelance. Mostly." "Oh, right, right," he said, with a tone that hovered somewhere between polite interest and mild confusion. "That must be relaxing." I smiled because it was easier than explaining deadlines, revisions, or how I hadn't taken a real vacation in 3 years. Dad said nothing, didn't jump in to clarify or back me up. He just sipped his soda and stared into the middle distance, like maybe he hadn't heard, maybe he hadn't, or maybe he had, and just didn't think it needed correcting. Chloe floated by again, looping her arm through Ryan's. "Dad, did you tell them about the fellowship I got offered?" "Not yet," he said, voice warming for the first time that afternoon. "I figured I'd let you brag." Everyone laughed. Chloe did that thing where she fake bowed, and Ryan kissed her on the temple. I reached into my bag, found my sketchbook, and opened to a blank page. Drawing had always been my way of disappearing. I shaded in a fox under a pine tree, half listening to the stories swirling around me. Everyone in the room seemed to know who they were, where they were headed, what they were worth. I wasn't angry, not exactly, just distant, like a guest in a family I belonged to only in theory. I looked up once and caught Dad glancing my way. For a second, I thought he might say something, but he just nodded again, faintly, before looking back at Chloe. That nod, always the nod. Sometimes I wondered what it would be like to hear the words behind it. When I was 16, one of my pieces got accepted into the state high school art showcase. It was a charcoal drawing of my grandmother's hands, wrinkled and gentle, holding a teacup with a chipped rim. My art teacher, Miss Carlyle, cried when she saw it and insisted I submit it. The exhibition was held on a Saturday afternoon at the Community Arts Center downtown. My mom came, Of course, she even made cookies for the volunteers. She wore her proud mom's smile and pointed my name out on the placard, like she was announcing the Nobel Prize. Dad didn't make it. He had a student tutoring session, or maybe he was grading papers or watching a game. I don't remember exactly what the excuse was, just that it wasn't urgent, just that it wasn't me. I told myself it didn't matter. I walked Mom through the gallery, pretending not to look for him when I got home that night. The drawing was already boxed up, and the living room TV was on. Dad didn't ask how it went. Did they frame it well? Was all he said. I said yes. He nodded. That was it. Years later, when my first illustrated book was published, I mailed him a copy. It was called Maple and Moonlight, a soft, whimsical story about a fox and a bear who built a treehouse to escape the noise of the world. The author had picked me specifically for my style. Delicate but grounded, she wrote in her email. It wasn't a bestseller, but it got a lovely review in a small parenting magazine, and a librarian from Minnesota emailed to say she'd added it to their kindness shelf. One morning, I found out a local paper had run a feature on my work. Tacoma native brings whimsy to the page. They'd interviewed me by phone and asked about my upbringing, my early influences, and I'd mentioned my dad. He was an English teacher, I said. He gave me my love for stories. I printed a copy and brought it over when I visited home that weekend. Mom had already cut it out and stuck it on the fridge, right under Chloe's med school acceptance letter. She hugged me and said she was proud. Dad was sitting on the back porch, reading a hardcover history book, with a ribbon bookmark sticking out like a tongue. I handed him the article, nervous for some reason I couldn't name. He read it slowly, lips moving just a little as he went. When he finished, he nodded once and said, "It's nice. You think you'll be able to live off this kind of thing long term." That was his response. Not congratulations, not well done, not even good job. Just a question about stability. I remember standing there, the air around us filled with birdsong, and the smell of rosemary from Mom's herb pots, thinking, he still doesn't see it, doesn't see me. It wasn't cruel. He didn't mean to cut me down. He was being practical. It was how he spoke to his students. How he operated achievement was a means to a goal. Not the goal itself, but art doesn't always come with a paycheck, and validation isn't always measured in bank statements. Still, I nodded back and said, "Yeah, I think so," and we both sat there, side by side, with too many words between us, and not enough bridges. I've thought about that moment more times than I can count, not because it was the worst, but because it was so quietly definitive. A line drawn in faint pencil, no confrontation, no shouting, just absence, the kind that follows you into every room, waiting. By late afternoon, the house had grown louder. More relatives had arrived, carrying bottles of wine and trays of food, and stories that didn't include me. The air inside was thick with perfume and laughter, and the clinking of glasses. I moved through it like a ghost in my own life, smiling when people made eye contact, laughing at the right beats, retreating as soon as I could. I found a quiet corner in the den, behind the door that never fully closed. The old recliner was still there, the one with the torn leather arm Dad always rested his elbow on when reading. I curled into it like a habit and opened my sketchbook. Outside the window, the garden was blooming early. Mom had planted tulips in mismatched rows, reds and yellows competing for space, like the voices in the next room. I drew them slowly, one petal at a time, not for a project, not for a deadline, just because it gave me something to do with my hands. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone opened a bottle of champagne, and a round of toasts began. I heard Chloe's name again and again, her promotion, her fiancé, how she'd always been a star. Someone called her the Brooks family legacy. I kept shading the stem of a tulip. It wasn't jealousy, at least, not in the way people assume. I was happy for Chloe. She deserved the love, the admiration, the spotlight. She worked hard, carried herself with grace, and never asked for more than she earned. It was just tiring. Being the footnote, Aunt Karen popped her head into the den. "There you are," she said brightly. "I told someone you'd probably be off sketching somewhere." She grinned. "You're like the family's quiet little mystery." I smiled because it was easier than correcting her. When she left, I pulled my knees up and stared at the blank half of the page. The pencil hovered, waiting, but nothing came. It was then I heard Dad's voice in the living room, steady and low, recounting Chloe's med school rotations. People were gathered around him, listening, like he was giving a lecture. He spoke of her kindness, her work ethic, how proud he was of her choosing pediatrics, because she always had such a gentle heart. The silence in me deepened. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. It felt more like compression, like the weight of being unseen pressing into my chest, with just enough force to keep me quiet. I closed the sketchbook. What would I even say if I spoke? That I'd just finished a 3-month commission for a children's grief support group in Chicago, that one of my drawings had been turned into a plush toy, that kids now held during counseling sessions, that someone's child fell asleep tracing the lines of a fox I created. Would it matter? Would he nod? Would he finally say it? I pressed my thumb into the cover of the sketchbook until the skin turned white. I don't even need him to be proud. I just want him to see me. That was the truth of it. The raw, unvarnished center. I wasn't looking for applause or approval. I didn't need a banner or a toast. Just a single moment where he looked at me, not through me, and said something that made me feel like I existed outside the parentheses. Someone in the other room clinked their glass again. Another laugh. Another anecdote. I stood, tucked my sketchbook under my arm, and slipped down the hallway to the back porch. The air was cooler out there. Realer. I sat on the steps and let the sounds of celebration fade behind me. For now, I just needed space to breathe. I had just come back inside to refill my water when I got swept into one of those living room clusters, half-circle of armchairs. Folding chairs pulled in, people balancing paper plates on their laps. Someone handed me a mini quiche I didn't ask for, and I took it, more out of habit than hunger. Chloe was seated beside Ryan, her hand resting gently on his knee, while she talked about residency hours. Everyone listened with reverent fatigue, like war veterans sharing stories from the trenches. "So, you're working like 80 hours a week?" someone asked. 90. "Some weeks," she said, almost apologetically. "Good God," Uncle Bruce muttered, shaking his head. "She's going to be the one keeping us all alive one day." A round of laughter followed. Then came the voice I'd been unconsciously avoiding all day. Aunt Diane, holding a plastic cup of rosé, leaned forward with that familiar glint of loose-tongued affection. "You know," she said, gesturing her cup between Chloe and me. "Chloe's always been the golden one. That brain, that drive. I mean, really every family's got their superstar." She turned to me, smiling too brightly. "And Lena, you've always been so artsy, like a phase you never grew out of." "Huh," the room chuckled. Not cruelly, just lightly, politely, the way people laugh when something sounds like a compliment, even when it isn't. I felt the heat crawl up my neck before I could stop it. The quiche in my hand suddenly seemed absurd. I placed the plate down on the coffee table, preparing to stand, to smile and excuse myself, and find somewhere quiet to disappear into again. And then Dad looked up. He hadn't said much all day, but now his brow furrowed, and he slowly set down his drink. "That's enough," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a sudden gust of wind, scattering any trace of laughter. Diane blinked. "Oh, Richard, I didn't mean—" "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, and the words landed with a weight I hadn't heard in years. I froze, half standing, heart in my throat. What was happening? For a moment, no one moved. The air in the room felt strangely suspended, like the beat right after a power outage. When everything's quiet, and no one knows what to say. Dad stood slowly, His cup still sat untouched on the side table. One hand rested on the back of his chair, the other in his pocket. His eyes were fixed on Diane, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of calm precision I recognized from the nights he used to grade essays at the kitchen table, the look that meant he was about to say something important, and it was best not to interrupt. "That's enough," he repeated, his voice even but firm. "You don't know what you're talking about." Diane shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. I didn't mean anything by it.
"Richard."
But he wasn't looking for an apology. He turned, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he looked directly at me, not past me, not through me, at me. "Lena's work," he said, voice rising just slightly, "is in libraries across the country. Children fall asleep to her illustrations every night. Her name's on the cover of books that help kids understand friendship, grief, imagination, things half the adults in this room couldn't explain if they tried." He turned his gaze back toward the rest of the family. "You think that's easy to do?" The silence deepened. She built something from nothing. No corporate ladder, no company benefits, just talent, deadlines, and a kind of courage none of you have had to test. He let the words sit there for a second. Then his eyes returned to mine. "I don't say it enough," he said. "I probably never have, but I'm proud of you. Lena." I didn't know how to move. My entire body felt like it was holding its breath. Dad glanced around the room again. Everyone's quick to celebrate a title or a paycheck, but it takes something else entirely to turn what you love into something that helps other people love better, too. Diane had gone quiet. Chloe looked surprised, but not resentful. Her hand rested gently on Ryan's arm, and he leaned in to whisper something to her. A few people nodded. No one laughed. I hadn't realized I was still standing until I felt my legs start to shake. Dad sat down again, like nothing extraordinary had happened. He reached for his cup, took a sip, didn't look at me again. But he didn't have to. He'd already said everything I'd been waiting years to hear. The room didn't move. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but charged like the air, right before a thunderstorm or the second after a truth finally lands. No one picked up their conversation. No one cracked a joke to fill the gap. Even the background music, faint from a Bluetooth speaker in the dining room, seemed to fade into nothing. I stood frozen, one hand still hovering near the back of the chair I'd almost walked away from. Across the room, Dad looked at me again. Not the quick glance, not the habitual nod. A full look, steady, undeniable. "I'm proud of you," he said, voice quieter now. "I haven't said it enough, but I am." I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because my throat had gone tight, like something inside me had uncoiled and didn't know where to go next. Somewhere to my left, someone exhaled slowly. A cousin shifted on the couch. Chloe reached for her glass of water with a hand that trembled slightly, but Dad, he just sat back in his chair and looked down at his lap for a moment, like he'd released something that had been sitting inside him for too long. I nodded. Finally, a small, slow movement. That was all I could manage, but it was enough. The sun was beginning to set when I slipped out onto the back porch. The sky was a wash of coral and lavender, the kind of light you only get for a few brief minutes if you're paying close enough attention. I sat on the top step, sketchbook still pressed against my side. Though I hadn't drawn a single thing since that moment in the den, I didn't cry, not because I wasn't moved, but because something deeper than tears had taken hold, like my body was catching up to a truth I'd never dared to believe could arrive. The screen door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn. Dad stepped out slowly, his footsteps careful against the wood. He didn't sit right away. For a second, he stood behind me, as if weighing whether to speak, or maybe waiting to be invited. Then he lowered himself onto the step beside me with a soft grunt. Neither of us said anything. The wind rustled the trees. A car passed somewhere far off. We sat with the kind of silence that wasn't awkward anymore, just full. After a moment, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, padded envelope. He handed it to me wordlessly. Inside was a copy of Maple and Moonlight, my first children's book. The cover was slightly worn, the edges a little frayed. One of the pages had a faint crayon mark in the corner. The spine had been repaired with clear tape. I stared at it. I thought it was out of print, I murmured. He nodded. Your mom said it was. I found a copy on eBay. I ran my fingers over the cover. It wasn't just a book. It was proof of something I'd made, something he had kept. I looked over at him, and he was watching the sky, not expecting anything. Just, there, sis, for the first time. That felt like enough. Back in Portland, the light in my studio felt different. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon sun filtered through the west-facing window, or maybe it was just me seeing things a little clearer. I unpacked slowly, shoes by the door, sketchbook on the table, that old, worn copy of Maple and Moonlight on the shelf, between books with shinier covers. I brewed a cup of tea, sat at my desk, and opened a folder I hadn't touched in nearly a year. The working title was The Quietest Girl in the Room. It was meant to be a graphic novel short, poetic, filled with soft pastels and blank spaces. I'd written the outline years ago, a little girl who moved through her home like a shadow. She wasn't sad, exactly, just unsure if she belonged. Her family didn't mean to ignore her. They were just louder, brighter, easier to notice. I'd sketched the first half pages of her sitting quietly at dinner, watching her siblings get praised for grades, goals, trophies. She had a gift. Ew. She could draw light into places no one else saw. But no one ever noticed. That was where I'd stopped. Until now. I picked up my pencil and turned to a fresh page. This time, the girl didn't disappear. This time, someone called her name not in passing, not like a question, but like a fact. With warmth, with weight. She turned, lit up from within. Not because the world finally saw her, but because someone who mattered had seen her all along and said so out loud. I drew her smiling. I drew her standing taller. I drew her in color. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the space inside me go quiet, not empty, just finally full.